Yahweh for inviting me here today. I'm very happy to be here and to share what I've learned over the years about tattooing. And I'll try to go through this sort of rapidly because I have a lot of information to share, and I may not get through the presentation, but I'll do my best. My name is Michael Galban, and I'm the director of the Seneca Art and Culture Center at Gannon-sen State Historic Site, and where I've been working for the past 33 years. When I started to work at Gannon-sen, which is, of course, an ancient Seneca town site, my boss at the time, Pete Jemison, had a project in mind to reconstruct a bark longhouse, and he wanted us, the interpretive staff, to kind of understand that time, right, long ago. What was it like for Seneca people? What was the material culture? What were the things that people used? What was the lifestyle? What was the day like? You know, how did people look? What did they dress in? You know, how did they appear? And so, you know, the way we had always done that kind of research is to simply ask the elders that we came into contact with, you know. And so that's what I did, you know. And I was very interested in tattoos. You know, I was one of those bad kids in the 90s who, as soon as they were able to, got to a tattoo parlor and got tattooed. It was the first of my friends and everything. You know, it's all about, you know, appearances for me, and it was like, I don't know, attractive to me for some reason as a young guy. And that led me to kind of try to understand, like, what was the tattoo traditions of my own ancestors, who are Northern Paiute and Washoe, and also what are the tattoo traditions of Haudenosaunee people long ago. And so, you know, in my limited ability to research, you know, very basic stuff, I was encountering all kinds of images and descriptions, really, of people long ago, of Haudenosaunee. We'll just say broadly woodland people, right? And the designs and the styles of what they were wearing was pretty interesting to me, and so that's really when I try to combine what was an oral history understanding of tattooing. And so the first person I asked was Huron Miller, and Huron and Vera were sitting at a picnic table at Gannon-sen, and I sat with them, and we just asked them questions, have lunch or whatever, and it was really nice. But I asked Huron directly. I was like, so did Haudenosaunee people tattoo themselves long ago? And he just said, no. That's all he said to me. And that was confusing to me, right? Because I was being confronted with these old historic images, and that's really where, I mean, Jamie's entire piece fits into that narrative, right? During Huron's lifetime and his experience and the experience of his grandparents, probably, you know, it just wasn't a thing. It was not done, and he just said no. And so even today, I think there's a certain amount of kind of conservatism in the Longhouse about tattooing and those traditions. But of course, young people are very interested now in understanding it, and so how do you resolve what is a historic practice where things were very different than the way we live today, extremely different, and how do we incorporate it today? So, and then that led me into the language, trying to understand, trying to find words. You know, people didn't even remember words, like the language of tattooing. And, you know, it turns out that I actually have to amend this Nyawa, because I learned later that it was actually Jamie who told Gahoana, and then it came to Marion, and then they resurrected and found the word again in the old dictionaries. But so this is the word, and maybe Jamie, you could pronounce it better. So he's saying he is tattooed. And this is the conjugations of it, of the term. In what is the old language, right? And I don't know if Jamie got into that very much, but the old language of many hundreds of years ago for Haudenosaunee people was very much more mutually intelligible, almost one language, right? And then over the next couple hundred years, 300 years or so, languages, kind of separate and become more distinct amongst each other. So that was really important. So I'm going to quickly go through what is a kind of a survey of the historic record. Okay, this is observations essentially by white people, right, who came, saw Native people, wrote about them, wrote about how they looked, wrote about what they wore and tattoos, how they did it, and that's really one of the ways that we can understand what was being done long ago is from these eyewitnesses, okay? Now, there are problems with that, and we have to understand that the problem comes from the eyewitnesses' ability to have access to everyone, you know what I mean? In other words, to children and women and others, so almost all of the descriptions end up being about men. So we can say a couple things about that. One is, well, it seems to be a masculine custom, right? And Jamie has pointed out that it is aligned very closely with warrior societies, like groups of men, the warrior types, the warrior class, you might even say, right? And so we have to kind of do a really deep search to try to find out what other people were doing and if they had the practice as well. So this is a good description. I'm probably not going to read each one, so as I'm talking, if you can kind of read along, it will help you kind of understand and see the patterns within the eyewitness descriptions. The more descriptions you see, the more the similarities of the descriptions appear, and you can then understand what is more common across the board. This is how you conduct historic research. You try to get as big of a group of information and study set as you can, and then notice the similarities and say like, okay, this is very common, this is a little bit more unusual, and this is more rare, but then you can really get an understanding. So there are literally hundreds of these historic descriptions by Europeans of indigenous people and the decorative way that people dressed. Fashion, what did it mean? Was it just to look cool, or was it to invoke real world entities, or is it therapeutic? Is it medicinal? So all these things appear in this historic record. This is the Mercure Galban is a magazine, actually, that was published in France. There's a few different magazines that appear in Europe, and people would report to them, and they would get published, and that's how Europeans learned about Native people. But in them are some really interesting descriptions and even interviews with Native people about how they appeared and their tattoo traditions. In this one, it says, the bodies of the gentlemen sauvage. Today, savage is has a negative connotation. For the French people, sauvage meant wild. In other words, natural. So like a buffalo, they called vache sauvage, right? A wild cow is a buffalo. It doesn't mean it's savage like today. We think of savage as being like primitive and like brutal and brutish. But the bodies of the gentlemen sauvage were almost naked and covered by hundreds of different drawings depicting snakes and bears, pigs, muskrats, crows, and small dots. This is an image of a Piankashaw man who came from the Illinois country, and he has combinations of paint and tattooing on his face, and of course all kinds of different ornaments, silver and hair pieces and feathers and all kinds of things. But you start to kind of imagine like what these men were looking like. Almost all the images of tattoos are of men, by the way. McCullough says, the old Indian had his body covered over from head to foot with certain hieroglyphics. So this is an important word, right? Hieroglyphic is not just design, it's not just sort of beauty, right? It actually it means images which have meaning, like you think of like Egyptian hieroglyphics. You can read Egyptian hieroglyphics because the images represent ideas and words and notions, right? So the native tattoos are considered hieroglyphics because they can be read. And if you understand the language of symbols, which was almost universal all over the East Coast, from Maine, from what is now Maine and New Brunswick to through Haudenosaunee Territory down into the southeast and west to the Mississippi River Basin. The tattoo customs were similar, and the language of design was similar amongst all those peoples. Okay. This is an image of a Lenape man. His name is Lapuensa, and his tattoos at the neck, very similar to the tattoos that Jamie showed from the Wendell family journals and diaries. He has a tattoo off of the mouth, which seems very, very common. We see this in a lot of leadership images of Native leaders, and there is a lot of evidence to say that tattoo off of the mouth refers to a speaker, someone who has the ability to, or is given the right to speak for people, to speak for a people. On his forehead is a very common kind of motif in tattooing all over the Northeast and Southeast. It is bird designs and snake designs. And these two kind of sets of animals represent this cosmic tension between the sky world, things that live in the sky like thunderbirds and things, and the underworld, which is represented by serpents or horned serpents or beings that are under the plane. Like we live on the plane of existence, and there's things that are above and things that are below. There are things that exist in a couple different planes, like the otter that Jamie was talking about. The otter lives on our plane, walks around, and then yet lives also under the ground, under the water, below our plane. Birds too, like there's exceptional birds that live in all three, right? Think about like a duck. A duck can fly, a duck can float and walk, and a duck can dive, right? It can go into all three realms. And so they're very special beings who can navigate the three different realms, right? So he's got swallows, which are in the folklore traditions and the storytelling traditions, I call them agents of the thunder beings, and they're like real world agents of things that we have little understanding of, right? They're hard to understand, powerful beings. So we'll get into those right here. So there were 4 guys that went to England in 1710, and many times they're known as the 4 Kings. These are 4 leaders who went to England to reconfirm a peace and ask for help, protection and help from Queen Anne. And while they were there, they were much lauded, feted. They were parties and balls, and they were brought all over. And they were painted even by a number of different artists. And of note in the paintings are these men's tattoos. So you can see this man has those combinations. I highlighted them because it's hard to see, but you see he's got birds, could be thunderbirds or thunder beings, and then he's got that tattoo off the side of his mouth as a speaker. This is the same man painted by a different artist, but you can see, you can see the bird tattoos drawn all over his, on this right side of his face. The white fluffs in his ears, men would pierce their ears and stretch them out, and they would put either eagle down or swan down in them, and they kind of looked like feathery pom-poms. This was a custom that kind of fell out of fashion by the mid-18th century. You don't really see it very often, but this is a bone comb showing a man and his portrait, and you see different elements on here. You see the birds coming across his side of his head. You see an abstracted serpent that looks like a curvy arrow, and something on his neck that we don't know what it is. It's when you're looking at these images and the iconography, the symbols, Lafitau makes an important observation. He says, they learned also that of making magnificent embroideries on living flesh, and of making themselves coats, which cost them dear in truth, but have this convenience that they last as long as they do. The work is the same as that which is done on leather. And so what is he talking about? Well, what he observed was painted hides and on bags and robes and clothing. And this is an example on the right of a bag that is in the Musée de Quai Branly that actually Jamie and I were so fortunate to see in person and to see the designs and study them. And so you start to see the similarities, right? And so what I'm suggesting is that there's a language of symbol and design which is more widely understood than maybe people think. And it crosses linguistic and national borders, okay? And I'll explain why. Well, I'll just say, the reason why to me is that this custom of design and tattooing and painting hides and things pre-exists distinctive regional, ethnic, and national boundaries. Okay, it comes at a time before people were distinctly Onondaga, before people were distinctly Cherokees or Lenapes or Shawnees. You know, it came into being before maybe all those distinctions occurred. This is a coat that emerged in the 90s again in France, and you can see the designs very much look like the man on the right and his tattoo designs. The man on the right is actually a Meskwaki man. Today, the Meskwakis are called sometimes Sac and Fox in Oklahoma, but where they are in Iowa, they still call themselves Meskwaki. And Meskwaki, I was told by a Meskwaki elder that they consider themselves the historic neutral peoples which lived along the Niagara Escarpment down into the shores of Lake Erie, who were dispersed in the 17th century during the wars between border nations to the Haudenosaunee. So but still in all, Meskwaki people some remained in Seneca territories and lived at Squawky Hill near the Gardeau tract, near Mount Morris, what is now Mount Morris, and kind of just became absorbed into Seneca people. But anyways, you can see his tattoo designs all over his body. In 1708, this is reported, I witnessed the death of an Indian at the Hotel Dieu in Paris, who had been marked in this manner. The surgeons flayed him and had the skin dressed without the slightest change taking place in it. And then they tacked the poor man's skin to the door of Hotel Dieu as a curiosity to the French public. And the Hotel Dieu is right in the shadow, essentially, of the great Notre Dame Cathedral. And when we were there, I was like, entertaining the idea of like going there to see if they had anything. Hey, you got any old leather laying around somewhere? But we didn't. This is probably the most famous full-length portrait of those four kings. It's probably the most detailed in the tattoo renderings. In London, they wrote about the men. They said their faces, their visages are very awful and majestic, and their features regular enough, though something of the austere and sullen. That's the stoic Indian face, right? And the marks with which they disfigure their faces do not seem to carry so much terror as regard with them. And so the men went all over, and people just loved seeing them, and they show their tattoos. Here's some more portraits, kind of giving you a sense of like the aesthetic of the time. In the center, the man in the center, who's known as Brant, actually his English name, has a tattoo on the center of his chest, and that center design is actually a crayfish. It's a crayfish design, and you might think that, well, why would you want to evoke like a crayfish in your tattooing and as a one of the warrior class? But the crayfish, if you study and learn about the old stories, which I encourage everybody to do, and I would say to go to Jeremiah Curtin to read every single story in there, because they're all told to Jeremiah in the 1800s by Seneca storytellers, and they're all old and authentic stories. And in it, you learn that crayfish are actually tremendous warriors, and they're incredible. Even though they're small, they're mighty. They never retreat by turning their back on their enemy. They're always facing their enemy. And it doesn't matter how big you are, they're going to try to get you with their claws, no matter what, even if they're overwhelmed by your scale. And so you can see the crayfish design even on the left-hand side on the bag, rendered in quills. Lafitau, which is another important resource for people to read. He wrote a 2-volume book on basically on Haudenosaunee people, actually. He was a Jesuit, but don't hold that against him entirely. He was a good observer, and he wrote quite a bit. He had a keen insight into people and culture, and and language, of course, yeah. That was one of their methodologies, was to understand language, because in order to understand culture, you have to understand language. And that was their method to try to really understand what a people are, right? So he writes about their tattooing. He says, the Indian, to make his portrait, in other words, to draw a portrait or to recreate a portrait, draws a simple line in the form of a head, hardly putting any marks on it to denote the eyes, nose, and other parts of the face. And in their place, he traces the marks tattooed on his face, as well as those engraved on his chest, and which, being peculiar to him, or like distinctive to him, render him recognizable, not only to those who have seen him, but also to those who, knowing him only by his reputation, know his hieroglyphic symbol. As formerly in Europe, a person was distinguished by his coat of arms, and today we distinguish a family by their armor. And so what he's saying is that the tattoos are so unique to the person that they are totally unique, and no one has the same tattoos as you. And so there's or combination of tattoos, you might say, right? Okay. Sagard, even earlier in the 1620s and 30s, talks about how they actually accomplish it. They puncture the skin with small pointed bones, and filling these punctures with the dust of pounded charcoal. Maybe we'll get into that if we have time. This is an Oneida man named Good Peter. Good Peter was a converted Christian and fought in the American Revolution and fought for the rights of his people even, brought petitions to the government to recover Oneida lands. During the American Revolution, he went to the British and asked for help, and they imprisoned him at Fort Niagara. So you ever go to Fort Niagara, they put him in the hole, they called it, or the dungeon. But Good Peter is and was a warrior. You can see by his haircut, the scalp lock haircut, you can see by his tattoo at his throat, and even his severed and distended earlobes. You might think that it's just like a pierced hole that's like pulled open. It's actually totally severed all the way up to the top of the ear, and it's just hanging down, actually, which was a custom of the warrior class. This is a drawing done by a drawing of a board that was discovered in a Seneca community, and in the 1660s, 1680s, and they redrew it on a piece of parchment, and this was the man's tattoo. This is an image from the Wendell diary that Jamie was talking about. This is a man's face, even though there's no features. It's a man's head. He's got crosses on his cheek, which are called crossed lances or crossed spears. He's got the serpent on the side here and a serpent on the top. And then he's got a line that comes down like this, right down from the top of his head to the bottom with dots on it. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The man on the lower left, young Seneca man, he was recorded as living at the community which was today called White Springs, which is the sequential next town that people moved to after Gannon-sen was destroyed in 1687. So he was probably a child that had to escape the French invasion in 1687 and then grew up at White Springs, and his tattoos are recorded by Everett Wendell, which is really pretty amazing. This is a detail from a painting, and it shows a man in the background. I gotta go back. And if you look carefully at over his ear, he has those lightning designs coming down off of his temple. It's a fairly common tattoo that you see. This is another common tattoo design that's seen in many portraits of leadership and warrior class men. This is a detail from the death of Wolfe, which is a very famous painting by Benjamin West. The man who is kind of crouched over with his hand his chin on his hand has facial tattoos, shoulder, back, wrist, leg. He's completely tattooed. But we're going to talk about the tattoo that's at his ear. And we learn that West has a studio collection of objects that he bought from North America. Benjamin West was an American painter, having born and lived in what is now sort of western Pennsylvania, alongside Seneca people. And when he became a painter, he moved back to England and was kind of interested in recreating some of the native peoples that he grew up with and knew. And so he kind of did a number of paintings focused on native peoples, probably Haudenosaunee peoples. And to make it authentic, he ordered objects, literally, in the 18th century and got them into his studio and used them to help make his images more authentic. Moccasins and sashes and pipes even. And so this pipe, you can see the incising around the ear, that design. And some people might say that's a sun, which is fair, right? But if you look at his little tips on the ends of those blades, and I suggest that that's actually a calumet fan. In other words, the old pipes, they called calumet, long pipes, would have an eagle tail hanging down from it. And then they would decorate the feathers even, and they'd have little tassels or deer hair or something coming off the tips, which they used in the calumet dance. And in the old calumet dance, they would take the calumet and have two of them, and they would put them they'd raise them up like this, right? And sometimes there was a white one, and sometimes there was a red one, in contrast. But I suggest that that's what those are, is that when you bring the pipes up like this, the calumets sit like, or the fans sit like this. And then I found this woman online who had a weird one. I thought it reminded me of that calumet design. So here's a calumet that in Joseph Brandt's hands. In the image, the smaller image, you see a man with the calumet raised to his side. And then on the bottom you see one of the oldest drawings of a calumet from the mid-1600s. So you see the pipe, and then the long stem, and then the eagle tail hanging down. This is an image of another Oneida man with both lightning and calumet design on his ear from about 1790s. And this is a man holding a calumet, smoking it. This is a Mohawk leader they called King Hendrick, and King Hendrick was drawn a few times, painted once. This side is the original painting, which was destroyed in a fire, and then the engraving that was done after the painting. And you can see his tattoos. You see a calumet coming off of his ear, and then you see that tattoo off the mouth of a speaker. Another common tattoo is clan emblems. So people would frequently have their clan tattooed on their bodies. This makes it great at big gatherings, and you can see who's not in your family that you can try to get next to and talk to. Jonquière is a famous person at Fort Niagara, one of the original characters of Niagara. But he talks about it. He says, besides the arms of each village, like I guess the symbol of each village, right? Each tribe has its own, and every man his particular mark to designate him. Thus the Oneida designates his village by a stone and a fork. Next he designates his tribe by the bird or animal. He really means clan. And finally he denotes himself by his punctures or by the tattoos, which is a good insight that these designs actually are identifiers of who you are and what nation you're from maybe, and even what town. Here's a man with a turtle design or turtle tattoo on his thigh. It's probably Turtle Clan. Another man with a turtle right in the center of his chest. Let's keep moving. Sun and moon and celestial designs are also very popular in tattoos at the time. So he's got a sun in his chest. He's got a sun on his right breast. This man has two suns on each side of his chest. We're not going to read that all. But what he does talk about is the Los Gael is going to explain those bars across the face. The serenity of Michael's countenance. Michael was the name of this Lenape man. And he said, the serenity of his face when he was laid in his coffin contrasted strangely with the figures scarified upon his face when a warrior. Michael was a convert to Christianity. These were as follows. Upon the right cheek and temple, a large snake. From under the lip, a pole passed over the nose and between the eyes and to the top of the forehead, ornamented at every quarter of an inch with round marks representing scalps. Upon the upper cheek, two lances crossing each other, and upon the lower jaw, the head of a wild boar. He means bear, a bear. So he's probably a Bear Clan member. He's definitely of the warrior class, and the pole is a scalp pole, his personal war record on his face. This is a man with crossed lances tattooed on his face. It's kind of like a real modern hairdo. I can't explain that. In 1765, Scoluyade headed a war party from Shamokin against the French and made repeated visits of importance to the Six Nations as well as to the Western tribes. In a copy of his memoirs, by which it appears he had fought in 31 battles, had slain many, and taken a number of prisoners with his own hands. On his breast was tattooed the figure of a tomahawk, and on each cheek that of a bow and arrow. So bows and arrows also appear in the record. So this is actually the drawing that went with that the short story that was in the London magazine. And so you'll see these were all tattooed on the man's body. The individuals on the bottom with heads are captives. These are prisoners of war. The individuals on the top are deceased. They're without heads. That shows they're gone. And the marks on his leg are his defeated enemies. The bow and arrow denotes his class as a warrior. And E, they say, he called it a tomahawk, but it's really a knife, a blade. And so these blades that you see on the chest coming down, to me, are probably representative of a very ancient custom of bladed weapons that pierce the skin. Arrowheads, knives of stone, spearheads, maybe even back to atlatl heads, who knows. But that's what these things are, I think, to me. I think they're bladed, puncturing, representing puncturing of the skin in war, in battle. L'Allemand, he's talking about a man named Nero who had with his own hand killed 60 men in battle, and he had the tally of them on his thigh. Frightening guy, pretty rugged guy. An Iroquois sachem was called the Black Prince because his chest was literally black with a network of devices and designs tattooed into his skin with gunpowder. This was actually your own museum director, Hayden Haynes, sat for me and Robert Griffin to do a painting of this man, the Black Prince, and he's leaning against a tree and there's 3 guys working on him, putting his tattoos on his body. It looks really awesome. I thought Hayden was perfect because he's already tattooed, you know. I thought that'd be awesome, so that was a cool coincidence. So Pope says of the southern natives, he says, the old and young of both sexes undergo this operation in silence and without the least muscular distortion. I saw it performed upon a child of 4 years old who, when released, gave a shout and said, now I'm a man and a warrior too. So what is going on is he's actually connecting tattooing with rite of passage, becoming eligible to be a defender of your community, a warrior for your people, a soldier, the potential for being a soldier for your people. We see that over and over again in the record. This man, John Long, actually did a drawing, essentially like a modern flash sheet or a page that told like where you might find these different markings on a person. It's really crazy to find that, but that's what that is. These are different drawings, but they're not tattoos. These are actually dendroglyphs. And these are markings on bark or markings on trees, but what you're seeing are the same markings that you'll find on a body, on a person's body, the same markings that you might find carved onto a war club, same markings you might see painted or drawn or carved onto a piece of bark. And you start to kind of connect all these like visuals, and you start to see that there is a language of symbol and design that at the time was well recognized and understood widely by different nations. These are all just different designs, all of them coming from bone combs. So if you start to look at some of the designs that Seneca people put on bone combs, it's the same exact aesthetic. And then you start to see designs, you're like, hey, I've seen wampum belts that look like that. Oh, wait, wampum belts are geometric. Wampum belts have meaning. Wampum belts can be read. And so that's what I'm suggesting, is that all these symbols are actually a language of a semiotic tool that Native people used that superseded language. Okay. Hayden hasn't come in, so I'm just going to keep going, and if you got to leave, that's fine. I'm just going to keep rolling, and I'll keep on going until he comes and tells me that they need the PA. So the distended earlobe thing is important because it is for the men, almost always, but they separate the fleshy part of the ear away from the ear, and they will wrap it initially with medicine, plant medicine, and then later with lead, and then brass wire. And so, okay. The third, these are gifts that they were giving out in the 1650s. The third gift was composed of some sticks of porcelain worn by them in their ears, which are pierced with such very large holes as easily to receive a great stick of Spanish wax. And Spanish wax is like, do you ever see, like in the old movies, they have like a ring or a seal and they heat the wax over the candle and then they blob some and then they put the seal on there? Well, the wax bar is what they're talking about. It can be very big. He exclaimed, "Are for piercing your ears, in order that we may speak to one another as friends are wont to do, and that we may take part in one another's counsels." And so what his observation is telling us is that this was a custom. Piercing and distended earlobes was a custom and a rite of passage to allow a person to kind of metaphorically receive a message from someone else, to spark up or prick up your ears. And this is a close-up of that custom on that man. It's taking so long. Oops, sorry. Oh, man. I guess I have to be more patient. Some awls to pierce their ears. He's talking about gifts again. Some awls to pierce their ears so that they may not resist his words. You hear it? It's to open the ears is a metaphor for opening your ears to a message. Some awls to pierce their ears so that they may not resist his words, and tobacco, in using which they are also to burn their old customs to adopt better ones. This man, David McClure, he writes of the Ohio Valley peoples, Seneca people, who they call Mingos. So he saw an Indian submit to the barbarous operation of having his hair pulled out. This is that hairstyle, the scalp lock. But more importantly, he then laid his patient on his back, and placing a piece of wood under his ear, he cut with his jackknife, which was rather dull, the rim of each ear from top to bottom, leaving the ends adhered to the source. On the bow of the rim, he put pieces of thin lead to prevent adhesion and to stretch it. He bore the operation with wonderful fortitude, and now and then he shouted, "Huggy!" That is, "I am a great man." And I thought that was hilarious because if you're Mohawk and you say "Huggy," it does not mean you're a great man. It means you are in great pain. But his translator told him, "Oh, he's saying that he's a great man." This part of their headdress is said to be a preparation necessary for a warrior. The cold and phlegmatic constitution of the Indians perhaps makes them less susceptible to bodily pain than the Europeans. That's the old racist thing, like dark people don't feel pain as much as white people. George Smith in near Lima talks about a Seneca guy, young guy actually. A shavety knife or razor was sought for amongst the neighboring whites, but none of them being at hand, a hunting knife was sharpened. Placing a chip under the subject's right ear, a slit parallel with the outer edge of that member was cut all the way around, leaving a rim somewhat thicker than a pipe stem still attached at each end. The other ear was treated in the same manner, and both were bound up in sheet lead. When the Indian became sobered, he sat up, felt his ears, and finding that all was right, raised his hands in great delight and cried out. Can you say that, Jamie? I'm a great man, no longer a boy, a big man, or a big name.
That last week.
have a big name, right? Yeah. There's also an interest in kind of recreating that after the custom is long gone. And so this is a pair of prosthetic extended earlobes that was collected by a British officer and then descended through his family and wound up in British Columbia with a whole outfit. So the distended lobes and the clothing too. We can learn a lot from the portraits of the people. So self-portraits were done, especially on war clubs. This is a flat sword blade club, but you can see the tattoo designs on it. The comb that we saw earlier, and a shell mask, an ancient shell mask, showing a birdman, or a man in transition into a thunderbird. Here's some more self-portraits. This is a portrait on the back of a very famous bald-headed war club. You can see the man is kind of, you see his head at the top, and then kind of like squished in are his tattoos and shoulders and ribs, all the way down to his feet. This is another portrait on a club, showing shoulder tattoos and below war mats or war belts. Kind of highlight the tattoo marks here on the face. You see the scalp pole running across the face, that speaker tattoo, abstracted thunderbirds or birds all going across his temple. And then what's really interesting, the bottom tattoo is really interesting to me. The split-tailed bird, could be a swallow, whatever, an agent of the thunder beings or thunderbirds. And the orientation of it is really interesting to me because, you know, if you think about it, there are certain tattoos, and many of these that we're talking about are meant for others to see and to regard. So they're oriented so that the viewer sees it in the correct orientation. But this one is upside down from our perspective. But if you were the man and you looked down, you would see that thunderbird in the correct orientation to you. So it's for you, and you mostly is that one. So intentionality and orientation in art in general, not just tattooing, is a very interesting subject for me. Like if you look at old moccasins, some of them are clearly designed for others to regard, and some are clearly designed for you to look down and see the pattern correctly oriented to you. Same thing with leggings and shirts and dresses and things. It's something that people don't really think about very often, but when you start encountering these things which appear upside down or not correctly oriented, you really have to consider what is the function of the thing and who's holding or using it, right? And is it correctly oriented to them? This is a cool club in a museum. This is a bone powder measure. So back when people used muskets and things, they would make little measures to appropriately put into the barrel of their gun the right amount of gunpowder. And this one has a man's portrait on it with tattoo designs all over it. This is not for wide distribution, Mr. Schneider. So women's tattooing. So there, like I described earlier, there's a lot less knowledge of women's tattooing than men's, okay? Now that can mean a few things. One is, because you don't see it in the historic record, maybe it wasn't obvious, or it wasn't seen, or wasn't done, right, in the same regularity as men.